Thank you.
We're live.
Hello, good evening, colleagues and members of the committee. Welcome to the GARMS meeting on today, the 27th of April. If I can just start with our usual protocol, should there be any members of the public watching, we just need to make members aware and councillors present on the committee of our protocols for dealing with online meetings. I won't ask all members to introduce ourselves because I believe we've got a full committee, but we can do intros on reserves should there be any, but I don't believe there are. So if I can just refer to members that you are aware of the protocols for holding virtual meetings, and members, if I could please ask you have your cameras and videos on at all times and just mute your microphones when you're not speaking, that would be great. Should there be any technical problems, the meeting will be adjourned, and naturally if there's any issues with myself as chair, I'd ask the vice chair to just adjourn the meeting just so anything can be resolved. If members do lose connection, we can try and get people connected, and if technical problems do persist, of course, and the meeting falls in quorum, it will be abandoned to a later date. And so mobile phones off as per always. We do have a brief agenda tonight, but if I can just indulge members of the committee beforehand, if it's acceptable, we've had a verbal update from the Director of Finance, Section 151 officer, just on the statement of the accounts. That if I just propose to take that before we take the first substantive item, which is just before agenda item 8. It'll be a brief update, but want to keep the committee up to date nonetheless. And also, colleagues will remember we had a query regarding public health and COVID at the last meeting, which is with regards to the negative impact on communities and some sort of diversity, etc. So I believe we have a colleague from public health who will be joining our part 2 item where this kind of issue is raised within some of the risks to the council. So again, with your acceptance, we will accept that officer from public health to address the meeting at the relevant point. So I had no objections to that, so I take that as agreed that we'll proceed the meeting on that basis. So agenda item 1, formally, do we have any reserved members attending? I don't believe we do. And so that takes us very quickly on to agenda item 2 for members of the committee. Is there any declarations of interest to declare? We were asked to declare in advance, but if people haven't had the opportunity to do that, is there any to declare from the floor? Okay, we've had none indicated. Thank you. I don't believe there is any councillors backbenching, so I don't need to ask should any backbenchers have any declarations. The minutes, agenda item 3 from pages 5 in our bundle have been circulated. Do any members of the committee have any issues or comments on the minutes, or can we take them as agreed? Okay, I'm getting nods from around the screen, so thank you very much, colleagues. Agenda items 4, we've had no public questions notified, nor have I had any petitions notified on agenda item 5, and nor have I for agenda item 6 had any deputations notified to the committee, and nor have I for agenda item 7 had any references from council or any other committees or panel for our consideration. So as agreed before we move directly into agenda item 8, if I could ask the Finance Director, Dawn, to address the panel and give the verbal update. Thank you.
Many thanks, Chair. Good evening, everyone. I just thought it would be helpful to give you a very quick update on the statement of accounts, because by now you should have had certain bits of information from our auditors, which obviously you haven't received. So the auditors are running a little bit, Mazars, our external auditors, are running a little bit behind in terms of their processes. So in terms of the statement of accounts for 1920, you saw the auditors last year when they presented their draft findings, so everything was okay. And also you saw the auditors when they did their feedback from the report that was published by the Financial Reporting Council. Now, by now, obviously, we should have had everything, should have come back to GAMS confirming everything's okay with the 1920 accounts, but there's been quite a significant delay to this. There is a couple of reasons for that delay. because you should have had this back probably November, December time as a couple at the latest. There is a couple of reasons for the delay to this. With some staff vacancies, a number of their staff have left. Now we've been assured that they are recruiting 3 new members of staff that start in May for Harrow, and they've also been putting their audits through an additional check as a result of the recommendations of that FRC report, which, you know, was very, in some ways, quite critical about some audit practice, and obviously that has caused a delay. So in terms of 1920, obviously we are pushing the auditors to get this signed and, you know, and dealt with ASAP. And because in terms of the finance team, we're pretty much closed the 2021 accounts. I spoke to Lucy, our contact at Mazars, and this process now is absolutely urgent on her agenda. I said we have to get them accounts signed, and we're not the only ones. There is an issue with all auditors across London. So this is a top list. This is a top priority for Lucy, and Lucy will write to myself and Councillor Perry as chair of GARMS as soon as possible to confirm that process has been complete and there are no significant findings from the additional work that's been done. Now, in terms of the 2021 process, under normal arrangements, the committee would have seen all the audit plans back in January, so explain how the audits are going to conduct their work of the 2021 accounts. Obviously, you haven't seen that. Now, we are aiming, I spoke to Lucy, we are aiming to get that work to, Lucy's aiming to get that information to you by July, because if we don't meet the July GAMS meeting, it is September, which is way too late. The auditors have informed me that they have a timeline which is issued by MHCLG, that they have to have all their work completed by the end of September. That the auditors are clearly acting, that won't be done. But this will not be met for any London borough, so it's not as if there is any particular issue with Harrow, but we are high up on their list for getting things done first, because obviously we've explained some of the challenges we've got about moving to a new financial system. So we're going to move from SAP to Dynamics. So you will get that information in July, which obviously you can have a good look through. Now, obviously, I am disappointed in the challenges we're having with our external auditors. I've had quite a long conversation with Lucy, and we just have to we just obviously I've explained to Lucy that I do need to see a significant improvement in performance for 2021, because just because this is just taking up a lot of time, because it's just taking up too much time for us. So I thought that would just be helpful, just to give the committee a little bit of an update, because obviously you haven't seen some of the information that you would traditionally see. And then, as I say, the auditors will be at the GAMS meeting in July to explain what they're going to do for this year, and we'll be writing to Councillor Perry and myself soon to confirm everything's finished for 1920. So that's the end of my update. Thank you, Chair. You're on mute, Councillor Perry.
Thank you. It's been a long day. I was up early. Yeah, I've got a few comments and a question, but I'll let the panel and open that up to the committee first. So Councillor Abadi is indicated first.
Thank you, Councillor Perry. Yes, thank you for that update, Dawn. So yes, I think we all have to be understanding in terms of the way things work at the moment. So I don't have a problem with that. So and also I think it's important we support the auditors as well, because I think the reason why we have some of these auditors in place is because there's been a conscious effort, as a system, to make sure that auditors other than the top 5 are given this kind of work after the audit commission kind of took this work off their hands. However, having said that, yes, I'm just a little bit concerned about the fact that the audit committee hasn't received the plans or the planning document, because I don't think you need a lot of staff, because that's the key persons, which is Lucy, yourself, and probably one of the manager or assistants probably helping with this. We should have had the plan in by January, but I mean it's April, so we should really have had a plan. Even if they're not attending in person, it doesn't matter. So yes, I think you might just want to mention that to them. Is there a way we can at least see the plan? Because for them to come and speak to us in July when the audit, should be like, progress quite a bit. Yeah, I think it's not the end of the world, but it's not ideal. So that should have been in place. That's all I needed to kind of relay.
I thank you, Councillor. I suspect we're not going to get the plan even in writing because I don't think they've actually been done yet because they still haven't finished 1920. But I will certainly pass that point across if we can have anything earlier than the GAMS in July. I will strongly emphasise that point for you.
I'm sorry, Don. Just to sort of come back to you on the 1920. So this work outstanding. Do we know exactly what, why, and does that mean that Councillor Perry has not signed up the accounts for last year? Is that where we are at with 1920?
Yeah, so what will, in terms of 1920, they've had a number of staff that have left, and I do believe that some of that is about performance issues with their staff. They've also put extra checks in place because of the findings of this FRC report, so that has delayed things. And Lucy was because I think because of some of the staff issues, Lucy just was not wanted to check to make sure that work had been done properly, which is good. It's what should happen. And then, to be fair, with the impact of COVID, where we've all, has impacted on everybody, that has just led to a delay. And I suspect that one of the issues is it's not just us that's delayed; it's every borough that they're doing. So we obviously they don't just do the accounts for us; they do the accounts for several of the London boroughs. So it's primarily staffing and putting extra checks in place because of that FRC report.
Sorry, just my final question, so I can come off and other people can join in. I'm just wondering, so does that mean that there's a difference between the accounts and the audit? Because accounts more or less are prepared by you and your team, John. So it's the audit we kind of, right. I understand you're looking at. So is the committee expecting any findings? Because so far, I mean, as we've all mentioned, there have been no findings to report to the committee. And the fact that they finished the audit, that's what they told us last when they're here. Now they're saying there's still ongoing work. We don't know what that is and what were the issues if their staff were there and they've left. So is the committee expecting anything to be reported back to them regarding the 1920? Is there indication of that, Don?
Yeah. So to cover a couple of your points, so the first point is the actual statement of accounts were all prepared on time. This is the audit of the statement of accounts. So the finance team did everything they should do, and to give you confidence, the team are already pretty much halfway through the process for 2021, and the statement of accounts will be done by the end of May. So there's not been a delay in the work of the team. The moment the additional checks that have been done, Lucy has told me that there are no significant findings, so we're not expecting any findings from the additional work that has been done. And I certainly haven't been asked to make any adjustments, so no, we're not anticipating anything.
Right. Thank you, Don.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Bardia. Does any other member of the committee wish to ask Dawn a question or pass comment? No? Okay. I was going to ask about other boroughs, but you covered that point. But just to allay any concerns, we're not missing or going to not meet any statutory deadlines with these delays, are we?
No, because there are delays across every authority with every auditor, then we are not going to miss any deadlines. So all the delays have been cleared with MHCLG. So no, we're not going to get any penalties or anything like that for a delay. And just to give you assurance, Chair, we've done everything we should have to do by our deadlines. So we did last year's accounts by the deadlines, and we will do this year. In fact, this year for 2021, our deadline is the end of June, but we're getting them done by the end of May to give us time to get the team to work on dynamics. So we're a bit of ahead. We're a month ahead.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's fine. Look, at the end of the day, you've explained the position, and I think Councillor Abardia, speaking on behalf of his team, showed some understanding. It's not the first delay we've experienced over the last year or two. So, we just ask because the committee does take an interest in their opinion, and it often triggers discussion and lengthy ones, quite rightly. And so, as speedy as possible, we look forward to hearing from them.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, colleagues. That was appreciate that. So if we can now move on to our first main agenda item of this evening, which is agenda item 8, which is the internal audit and corporate anti-fraud plans for 2021-22, and this kicks off on pages 13 of our bundle. I'll ask Susan to introduce this element of the report. Before we do, just by way of meeting management, Susan, Shall we take the internal audit discussion first, and then, as we often do with the anti-fraud element, second, just so with questions or comments, because it's one report but can be quite easily just split just for chair management purposes, if that's okay.
Yeah, however you want to do it. Yes, fine.
Let's do that then. If you introduce your element of the report, we'll take questions and comments, and then we can move on to Justin's area. Thank you. Okay.
So this is the internal audit plan, the proposed internal audit plan for 21-22. It's the result of an audit planning process, which we talked about at the January meeting, and it takes into account the Council's risk management framework, the corporate priorities, and the requirement for myself to provide an annual internal audit opinion that covers the whole Council. It will be delivered primarily by a dedicated in-house team, although the committee are asked to note that there are some challenges with resources at the moment, which is explained in the report, and of course around the COVID-19 restrictions, which we are still dealing with. So we are still finding new ways and developing new ways of actually undertaking our audit reviews. The plan, as always, as each year, is flexible, and it may be adjusted throughout the year. Any significant changes will be brought back to the committee, but I think it's very important that, particularly in these times, that we can focus our resources where the business needs them to be focused. Internal audit's independence hasn't changed since previous years, and that is detailed within the report. In terms of projects, a few points I'd just like to draw to the committee's attention, which is slightly different from previous years or something of note. The first one is on the core financial systems. All of the core financial systems will be undertaken as evidence-based control self-assessments. We usually have a mixture of full reviews and control-based self-assessments, but our core financial systems are very stable. Year on year, we usually have green assurance or amber green assurance. And this year, because of the introduction of dynamics coming in, everybody has less time, and obviously COVID as well. A decision I took was that they would be all evidence-based control self-assessments. But in addition to that, there will be some specific testing on authorisations throughout the previous year. Because obviously things had to be done differently during the pandemic, and we want to make sure that the various transactions were appropriately authorised. We did give ad hoc advice during the year to managers on how best to manage this, but we just need to do some actual testing to make sure that everything was correct and correctly done. Also, within the corporate compliance checks, we've expanded this slightly this year. So for the third year running, we will have compliance checks on contract procedure rules, on financial regulations. And for the second year running, we'll have compliance checks on fees and charges. And a new area this year is on HR policies. And these are policies that are set by our HR team, are put out to managers to actually implement, but currently there is no checking to make sure that managers are actually implementing those correctly. So I've introduced that, and our new HR director was very pleased to have that included in the plan. Risk management in decision making is also there, and this was on last year's plan, and it is a real-time proactive review of risk covered in cabinet reports, and this was introduced in December 20 and has proved very successful and will continue throughout the following year. You'll also notice in there are a number of COVID grants that also now require checks to be undertaken and sign off by the head of internal audit and also the chief executive, who places reliance on checks that I will undertake, and that is included in the plan. As far as the KPIs are concerned, they remain consistent with the previous year. I'm happy to take any queries or any questions.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you for your report. It's robust and detailed, and so I'm sure we'll have some questions and comments. If any members have got any particular questions on particular detail, just to aid the committee members, just name the page in which you're asking. It just helps everybody follow. And so the first indicator is Councillor Marika. Councillor Marika, if you could unmute yourself.
Yes, this is just a question for Susan. You just told that COVID-19, you all gave the funding. One family has not got it and one family has been getting. Why is that? It has not been assessed properly. Any reason? What are your checks are doing? If a family is getting for one person, why the whole family is not getting it? That's the problem I have.
I think you would need. Oh, I think you would need to speak to the area concerned, councillor. The COVID checks that we undertake are a much higher level than the individuals, and also there's about, I wouldn't even like to guess how many different COVID grants there are. So, you would really need to go to the manager who is managing that particular COVID grant to get a specific response.
Thank you.
Councillor Rabadia, and then Councillor Moshinson.
You're muted, councillor.
I had a late night as well. Thank you, sir. Sorry. Yes, thank you, Susan, for that brief introduction. We have had the report in advance to look at the detail in any case. I just have a few quick questions, because you mentioned that you're going to do sort of a review on authorizations. So just wondering whether the authorizations are now all sort of stored somewhere online or in some kind of electronic format that you're able to check, because effectively you said the actual site visits are probably not allowed or impossible at the moment.
The authorisations that I'm talking about here are for the core financial systems, councillor. So they would be retained within what would have been the civic centre, and a lot of them, they will be electronic now. But when I say electronic, I mean they may be contained within emails, for example. So we will actually obtain our sample, and that may be just emails, or it won't be. So some of the authorisations used to be what they call wet authorisations, which was actually somebody signing something, and obviously we haven't been able to do that during the pandemic. So it's basically checking how did we get it, and we've often resisted emails because emails can not always come from the person that people think they've come from. So if you have a PA, example, they have access to your email. So that's the sort of thing that we need to be checking.
All right, so I understand. Thank you. Also, just in relation to that sort of, and just building up from what we've been hearing from you over the years. So one of the issues, I think my understanding was, we don't essentially have any sort of operational manual. So effectively, so when you're conducting your reviews, your tests, it's based on criteria you probably think should be in place in terms of the controls and authorization, for argument's sake. So it's still that the case. There is no operating manual for, to say, each department it is on a cycle of how the processes work and authorizations work and documentation and completion and review and sign-offs work.
So not every single system will have a manual. Where manuals exist and operations and processes exist, then when we do an audit, we do take those into considerations. But part of what we do might be to say, are they actually as robust as they need to be as part of the audit? But a lot of processes are not in writing, and there isn't a manual for every single thing that we do across the council. So what we do is we consult with the managers who are responsible for the service at the very beginning of an audit, when we're doing our planning, and we work out what are the risks, what could go wrong essentially in this service, and what controls need to be in place to actually prevent that from going wrong. And that's what we actually then audit against. But it is done in conjunction with the managers.
All right, okay, thank you. Just my final question in relation to sort of just building up on our sort of interactions over the years. So effectively, you've given us the plan and what's happening. So I'm just sort of trying to sort of understand how much of this plan reflects, findings or issues you considered or encountered in the last couple of years, for example. And my mind goes specifically to a major one that this committee got as a sort of a red report in, which was the governance side of things. So how much do you think has it improved, and how much of your concerns are reflected in your plan at present that you presented today?
That's a difficult one to answer sort of across the board, but basically we take our what we call audit knowledge. So we take our knowledge of what's happened previously in areas and we feed that into the plan. So some areas may be areas that we simply haven't looked at for a very long time and therefore we think that we need to review it. Other areas might be actually we have some concerns about that, or managers have mentioned to us that they have some concerns about certain areas, and all this is, if you like, put into the melting pot to work out, well, where would our resources best be used? So to give you an example, so HR policies, for example, has been included in the compliance testing because we're aware that there have been some weaknesses in the application of some HR policies in the past. So we built that into the plan. Does that make sense?
Yes, slightly. My concern was sort of, I am pressing a bit on the governance side of things because one, not only is it integral, but it was integral to sort of the future of this council specifically because the findings are in relation to, what's going to be our biggest outlay in terms of financing and everything we could think of, which is a sort of region, and there was governance issues around that. So I was just wondering how that kind of builds into a plan, or sort of getting aspects of it into our plans in the next year or two.
Well, in the plan there is a specific review about the regeneration programme and about revisiting that. Now that we are, I think, about 3 years down the line from when we did the original work, and it's not replicating the original work. It's basically looking at where we are now and making sure that things are, being controlled appropriately. We also had some work that is still ongoing around the depot with following that, the governance issues around that. And we're still following that up. So that is still ongoing at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Susan. So I'm sure we'll get a chance to revisit that in the next quarter or so. Thank you.
Councillor Moshinson.
Thank you, Chair. Susan, you mentioned that you have to write the plan inconsistent with the organisation goals. Can you tell me which of the goals you found for the next report to be the highest risk, and how is that reflected in the report, in your plan?
Okay, so just trying to see whether I actually put it in the that's a very, very good question. It's actually very difficult to answer. The new plan at the moment, the corporate plan, is what we haven't got because of what's happened with COVID is a detailed, and Councillor Perry might want to correct me on this, but my understanding is we haven't got a detailed plan of how we're going to implement that plan, if that makes sense. So it's been quite difficult to actually link a lot of the work that we're doing to some of those risks or some of those objectives. It is more relevant around the actual corporate risks is where the links are, and the corporate risks actually link back through to the corporate plan. Does that make sense? So we're in the plan, in my plan, where I've got that links to corporate risks, then those corporate risks are reflecting of the corporate plan.
Okay.
So we've got, for example, a link to corporate risk 3, which is around adult placements, and corporate risk 3 feeds into the actual borough plan.
So you're not building your plan from the objectives, but from the risks that have been identified in those objectives?
I suppose in a way, yes, because what I need is, what will make it easier to feed the plan into it is when we've got this actual operational plan, which is the bit at the moment that is missing because it's been put on hold because of COVID. And then once we've got that, that will make, if you like, the aspirations that are in the borough plan more operational, and what we're going to be doing operationally, which is really, my plan is operational rather than looking at aspirations.
So would you be revising that plan once?
If we get that plan, then obviously, and there's anything that comes out of that, as I said, it's going to be a flexible plan, and we will change it to meet the needs of the organisation.
And I'll just to come in there, just to come in, I think when you look through the plan, and sitting on the committee for a number of years now, is there's stuff that goes in there all the time anyway, which is quite regular, but that element of flexibility may change. And so looking at the plan, I think you can see that a lot of the key risks are ticked off, but it's a good question nonetheless, Councillor.
I accept that, Chair, and I will appreciate, having been on the committee for a number of years, that I only noticed this year that there's supposed to be a link to the corporate objectives, as opposed to the risks. That is what I always thought the link was, and it's hence my question this year and not 10 years ago. But okay, I'll wait to see. Chair, do you know when we're expecting to see a corporate plan?
I'm not a member of the executive, but I'm happy to. I don't want to give half an answer. If I'm going to address a public meeting, I'd like to be assured of the timeline, but I'm happy to find that out for you.
Thank you, and thank you, Susan.
Councillor Ali.
Thank you, Chair. Susan, just a clarification on page 16, resources and audit techniques. My question is towards risk manager's contract. Is it 6 monthly contract? So how does it work? Bit of clarification on that.
So, and it's actually more of a rolling contract at the moment. So we have had a risk manager who's worked with us for now over a period of about 10 years on and off. We haven't got funding for a permanent post. I have a very small budget within my budget for risk management. He has been with us this past year because, as I explained at a previous meeting, he basically helped because we had a resources gap, and actually we had quite a lot around risk management on the plan. He stayed and actually crossed between audit and risk management to an extent, but it is a rolling. We extend it basically. So he has now been with us for not quite a year, but by the end of June would have been with us for a year, and he has expressed that he would then want to seek different employment.
My question on just on the same one, because IR 35, is he on the payroll or
he's through per temps? He's not on IR 35. I wouldn't even consider it outside of IR 35.
Right. Okay, thank you. And then the second question on the same page is auditor's vacancy. I think, are you referring it back to last year, or what kind of auditor's vacancy since April 2020?
Sorry, what kind of sorry, I don't.
It's 2.15. You know, there's a line that's resources due to an auditor vacancy since April 2020.
Yes. Yeah. So we've had somebody left at the end of April 2020, and I haven't been able to recruit.
We still got the same.
We've still got a vacancy at the moment.
Is it affecting your work, or?
Sorry, that was partly why I kept the risk manager on for longer, because I had that flexibility in my budget, and we had the items within the plan last year, which made it a reasonable thing to do.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ali. Next question is from Councillor Benjamin, and while the question is being put, if I leave the screen, I'm just plugging in my charger to the iPad. So, Councillor Benjamin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Just a quick question. Could you expand, please, on the organisational independence, which is stated in section 2.12 of the report? Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm a little bit puzzled because section 2.12 emphasises the organisational independence of the audit team. And then in 2.13, it goes on to state that the objectivity of the service is impaired with relation to the corporate anti-fraud team, the maintenance of the corporate risk register. So could you expand on that? And can you also confirm that there is effective independence between the audit team and the corporate anti-fraud team?
Yes, Councillor. So the ideal in our professional requirements is that internal audit sits completely on its own with no other responsibilities. Okay, that is the ideal that our professional body would like us to uphold. The reality is that in every single local authority, the head of internal audit has other responsibilities, and these are most commonly for corporate anti-fraud and for risk management. In terms of the independence, there's a split, obviously, because Justin is the manager of the corporate anti-fraud team, and then he reports into me, and so my role is more of an oversight rather than a day-to-day doing. So if you like, I'm not actually doing the fraud work, so that's where the separation and the independence comes.
So it's oversight rather than line management, to put it bluntly. Well,
it is line management, but the line management is to provide oversight, if you see what I mean. So Justin is a manager. It's you know, he is an experienced fraud. He has more experience than I do in that area. He is the expert as such.
So does Justin report to you?
Yes.
Or does Justin report directly to this committee or the chief executive?
No, Justin reports to me.
Okay, so it's not entirely that. You see what I'm trying to.
That's why I've caveated the independence. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that is why it's caveated that it isn't totally. I'm not totally independent in respect of corporate anti-fraud, but this is a commonality right across all councils.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Bardia, you've indicated again.
Yes, Chair, I have. Thank you. I was just sort of touching on the same paragraph that Councillor just mentioned a few minutes back. This is 2.14. I think 1, 2, 1, 3 all sort of connected. It's the matter of where the audit team loses independence. So there's a few things mentioned in 2.14. This is how that you possibly wouldn't be independent, and you mentioned your responsibilities regarding the reporting, and your mitigation you mentioned is covered by the external auditors. So I've just sort of tried very hard to think, what kind of work they're doing will actually cover that mitigation. So could you explain why you think that where your independence is lost in this process, the external auditors are actually covering that?
As I said,
what I'm asking?
Yeah, so I have said it's limited assurance, but basically the external auditors do have they do ask questions about the corporate fraud function as well as the internal audit function. They have oversight of our audit reports. They also review the risk management process when they're looking at the annual governance review process. So there are a number of ways that the external auditors have like an oversight responsibility, and that's what I'm referring to there.
All right. Okay. So fine. So effectively, it's Are they doing any specific work or reporting that covers it, apart from just asking you questions?
They do
reporting
specific.
on any aspect of it, yeah.
Yeah, they do specific work as part of. So, for example, they look at the annual governance statement as part of their value for money work, and that's where they would have oversight for that. But do they actually issue a report that talks about it? Not unless they actually identified something that they were concerned about.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
And again, this is similar. This is the same across all local authorities.
Okay. Thank you, Susan.
Okay, thank you. There's no other indicator, so I'll take the floor now, just with some of my questions, if I can. And just before I do, our independent advisor John Kirkland joined us just after my introductions, and so he's sitting quietly in the meeting, but welcome him nonetheless. Just if I can go to page, and it's noted you've already covered the point around the resource. I was going to ask about the resource given the detail and the workload within the plan, so I'll move on from that because I think you've covered that. Just on page 17, Susan, on page paragraph 2.17, I think, and you've been very upfront with the committee around the challenges that COVID has posed with regard to face-to-face meeting. Of course, your goal is so face-to-face. It's very important to be, and timely too. So my question is really, given we've gone through what we've gone and we've got another robust, detailed workload put before the committee, is there any plan to go back to normal, given what you've indicated within the paragraph, as in the challenges that you faced this past year?
And certainly, I think it's all dependent on accommodation.
Yeah.
So, and until actually we are back in a civic centre or a building, it's going to be quite difficult. And as I understand it, that isn't going to happen until the end of this year or the beginning of the following year. So I think it's going to be quite difficult to start those face-to-face meetings, although there will be some, as I understand it, collaboration space that might be opening up within the current civic. So again, we will assess that once that becomes available, but that isn't currently available. As far as schools are concerned, I would hope that we would be able to get back out to schools, because I do think, because they're already remote from the council to an extent, their arm's length, I think it's going to be quite important for us to get out and about once we can. But obviously I need to make sure that it is safe for my staff as well as for anybody that we're auditing. So I think that both sides have got to be comfortable with that. But obviously, if we follow the path and things, touch wood, things keep going in the way that they are, I am quite hopeful that come September we may be able to start doing some school visits.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. Moving on to page 25.
Could I, before we move off of that, could I just mention, Chair, that so I'm a member of the London Audit Group, which is all the heads of internal audit across London, and I was quite surprised to hear that there are a number of London boroughs who just haven't done any schools audits at all, and there are others who've done far fewer than we have. So I'm actually very pleased that we have actually, I think, had a big achievement in doing the work that we have done in the past year. Sorry, just a little blow a trumpet there.
I think, yeah, why not?
I don't do it very often.
No, that's fine. And I don't think the premise of my question is to apply pressure. It's just for not just for me, but maybe the committee members, to try to understand what is the forward thinking over the next 3, 6, 12 months around your operational workload. That was all. My next question is on page 25, the authorization testing. You've allocated 20 days, and this is probably curiosity more than anything, where you're saying you're testing to cover core financial services, etc., and the authorizations that are given. Given there's 20 days, my question is, does this tend to uncover anything? And if so, does it uncover a lot of discrepancy around authorization on that area?
Well, we don't know until we've done the work, to be honest.
In
But
past years, I'm just querying.
Well, we haven't done that. This is a new thing.
That's
This is
a new one,
a specific thing because of what's happened during the pandemic. So I specifically wanted to have a look at how we have managed the authorisations during the pandemic, because I'm aware that we've had to change what we used to do and that we haven't been able to get these wet signatures. And the reason why it's 20 days is because we're covering all of those areas: housing benefit, treasury, housing rents, etc., all of those, plus pensions. So we've got to go to all those individual services, we've got to obtain the information from them, do our testing, and you know, that might be quite substantial in some of those areas because they do a lot of authorisations, so we need to look at a lot of transactions, and that's why it's 20 days.
I did read that explanation. I've now linked the two to the actual report, just the large figure of days allocated to it. It was just on page 27, there's a transformation program project management review.
Yes.
And this is a project management review of one of the projects within the transformation program identified at the time of the review. My question is, are there any that are in the frame as to what you're going to be looking at, or do you just generally not know there? Is there anything that's come to light which has made you author it in this way? There may not be, but it's out of curiosity.
To be honest, I've ordered it in that way to give myself as much flexibility as possible, so that when we come to do the review, we can actually look at, well, at what stage are all the various projects at, what money is being spent, because that's going to be relevant, and so that we can pick the one that we think is, if you like, the riskiest, so that we're actually putting our resources in the highest risk area.
And my last question, if I can, on page 28, at the top, traffic and highways, it's the second from the top. Again, the adequacy, application, effectiveness of management, procurement and financial controls of traffic and highways. It's exactly the same question. Is, again, this in there for your flexibility, or have you got a particular service or scheme within that area which you want to look at, or again, is it the same answer as before?
Sort of. This was actually a management request, and I do like to include some management requests, because again, you know, this is supposed to be you know, for the benefit of the council and for the management of the council, and it's put in there. What we will do is, when we come to do the report, we will hone that down, and again, so it is slightly, you give that broad picture at this stage, and then you can hone it just before you do the audit. And sometimes, you know, you do it like that, and other times you know exactly what you need to look at and you can put it in more detail.
Okay, thank you, that makes sense. And now, if I can, ask Justin Phillips to introduce the corporate anti-fraud plan for 21-22 within the report. And thank you, Susan, for your explanation and questions. Justin.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, Chair. So just following on from Susan, the draft fraud plan for 21-22 looks quite familiar compared to last year. We've taken into consideration some of the things that have come out of the local government fraud strategy, fighting fraud and corruption locally. That feeds into the development finalising of our fraud strategy for Harrow Council, crime surveys, discussions with the head of internal audit and the interim risk manager, local and intelligence about known fraud risks that we've actually identified during 2021, and national fraud risks and trends that we see that that other councils face, in particular London. Obviously, it's been a bit of a strange year this year, what with COVID and most people working remotely. With that has brought its own risks as well, with the central government funding coming to local government around grants and so on. This developing the council strategy will be a key theme for this year, because with the development of that will come an action plan. So we're using that as the template and the benchmark for us to push ourselves and to make sure that we are delivering best practice and doing the things that MHCLG want us to be doing to make sure that we protect the authority as best as we can, so that we fully mitigate any fraud and corruption risks during the year. The plan is delivered by an in-house team. There's no planned changes to those resources at this moment in time. So there's 5 full-time equivalent posts, including myself. And in terms of the plan and the performance indicators, so we've slightly increased some of the performance indicators just because we're trying to stretch ourselves and push ourselves. So key performance indicator number 3 around dealing with fraud referrals that relate to internal fraud has been increased from 80 to 85%, and dealing with fraud and corruption, other fraud and corruption referrals, that we've increased that threshold from 80 to 85% as well, just because we're trying to push ourselves and strive to improve constantly. That's it in a nutshell, really, about how we've put the plan together. I'm happy to take questions that the committee has.
Thank you, Justin. Okay, Councillor Ali. Councillor Ali, if you could unmute yourself so we can hear from you.
Thank you, Justin. So just a couple of questions, because you just referred that there was a decrease in the fraud and corruption internally. But what about externally, like housing benefits and others? Was there an increase or decrease during the last year lockdown?
Well, I think the figures for that are still probably filtering their way through the system. But if you recall, a number of years ago, whilst housing benefit is still administered by the authority, the fraud function that we used to deal with was taken away from the team and was then passed to the Department of Work and Pensions back in 2014. So we no longer deal with that housing benefit fraud risks, whilst obviously it's still administered. So that doesn't feature on our radar any longer.
I mean, did you come across any fraud for this business grants during the last year lockdown?
What I would say about that is that anecdotally, for the amount of money that was involved in the distribution of those grants, the cases that came to our attention were minimal. And this is quite interesting because as part of our membership with CIFAS, so we met, I think it was just after Christmas, and we had a workshop with all of the local authority members and some of the main players in terms of the banks. And the information that they were putting out was they were flabbergasted at the amount of money that went through those accounts in relation to COVID grants that local authorities were responsible for administering, and that the level of fraud that they had identified in those banks was minimal, absolute minimal. They were staggered at why they didn't see more, considering the amount of money that we were charged with administering and then paying out. So I took that as a bit of a pat on the back for the teams that were dealing with those grants. And I know that on the plan for 2021, both Susan's team and my team looked at some of the grants. I mean, Susan did the vast majority of that work, and obviously the outcomes of that audit will feature in the mid-year report, sorry, the year-end report. But I can certainly say from a fraud perspective, it was minimal. There were a handful of cases that were identified, and those were mainly identified by the banks themselves, that they felt as if something wasn't quite right with the grant.
Okay, thank you. That's brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Justine.
Sure, thank you.
Apologies if I lost connection there. I'm back in the room. Sorry, I missed you for about 15 seconds there. Sorry, Justin.
It's okay.
Would you, Justin, do you want to carry on your response?
I've come to a natural end.
Okay.
Answer a question. It's for others to ask, I think, now.
No problem. The next two indicators were Councillor Robardio and Councillor Benjamin.
Thank you, Chair. Justin, thank you for your introduction. But just a quick few questions. In terms of your pushing your KPIs, yes, commendable. I was just wondering in terms of do we have any sort of comparison, sort of to say, you know, how the KPIs measure against, say, firstly London-wide and then nationwide in terms of, you know, what are we striving to target or achieve?
Unfortunately not. There isn't a benchmark. There isn't any benchmarking data out there where you can compare authorities, and whereas historically we used to, because housing benefit was one of the major benchmarks in terms of the amount of fraud you identified and so on. But that was imposed by the Department of Work and Pensions, because essentially the authority was acting as an agent for them to administer those grants. So there isn't anything uniform out there. There isn't a level playing field, because obviously authorities have different levels of resources, and they have their own way of risk assessing what they feel are the significant risks that their authority faces. So what we feel is perhaps as a risk to Harrow may not be a risk to Barnet or Brent or Haringey. So there isn't that level playing field, unfortunately.
Sorry, yeah, thank you. Just to follow up on that, in terms of you know, just understanding what's driving your plans or initiatives. So where or how are you getting information to say, you know, oh, we must do this or we must spend more time on this area and resources, and you know, what kind of measures and intelligence gathering do you kind of engage into, sort of in terms of being proactive, you know, throughout the process?
Sure. So very similar to what kind of Susan referred to earlier on, we look at obviously anything that comes to our attention in the previous year or years, if we think that there is a continued risk alongside one of the services. So for argument's sake, we always look at the right to buy, because we just think, given the significance of the asset that we're looking at and the amount of money potentially that the council could lose by losing that asset if it is a fraudulent application, by way of a discount, somebody may get in excess of £100,000 discount on that property purchase. So, and the only condition stopping them from then reselling is that they have to hold on to that property for 3 years, and then they can sell it on, quite often at a significant profit. So things like right to buy is traditionally a high risk area, simply because of the amount of resources and money involved. So you know, there are plans. The National Fraud Initiative that comes out every 2 years. They produce a report and they tell us where the fraud has been identified. So that enables us then to look at those areas. Perhaps, obviously, lots of the stuff that we do is with Susan's service as well. So Susan might look at an area and start to sample things that perhaps are throwing up red flags. So we would then take a closer look at that area. We also look at one of the big areas is obviously where we have significant spend. So if we have an area like personal budgets and long-term residential care, which is a significant area of spend for the authority, it only takes a small percentage of perhaps of those applications to slip through the net for the council to be, you know, and the significant risk in terms of the financial losses around there. So all of this intelligence and information that comes in that we are able to review and process goes into us then weighing up where do we think our resources are best placed for the coming year. and that's what drives the development of the plan.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Benjamin.
Thank you, Justin, for the presentation. I've just got one or two questions. I'll just tell you what the questions are, and perhaps you can answer them accordingly. My first question is, do you have defined procedures in place in connection with obtaining evidence of fraud, and are they PACE compliant? That was my first question. My second question is, what protocols engage on anonymous referrals to the internal fraud team? And the final question relates to the equalities implications which were indicated on the report, and that is that on the implementation of the corporate anti-fraud and corruption strategy, has there been any audit, or will there be any audit, as to the impact on those with protected characteristics?
Okay. So I think your first question was around compliance with PACE. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So obviously, the PACE side of things forms, I suppose, the back end of our investigation work as such. So it's when we have to speak to a subject and a caution. So the way that we comply with that is that we make sure that officers have received regular refresher training on how they conduct that interview to make sure that they are PACE compliant. Obviously, if we're undertaking PACE interviews, then I would say 95% of those interviews are in the presence of a solicitor. And then if those interviews then go on into a prosecution of sorts, then we are strictly regulated by the criminal justice system. So if something was drastically wrong with what we were doing, first of all, I would not sign the case off, first of all, because if I felt it wasn't meeting with the PACE conditions. Secondly, our own solicitors would review that level of evidence in line with the code for Crown prosecutors, and they would pick up on something that they were uncomfortable with. And finally, obviously, when we get to court, we are then subject to the cross-examination from defence solicitors and barristers of where they felt perhaps if something was incorrect. So I'm quite comfortable with the checks and balances that we have in place to make sure that we are complying with that piece of legislation and that code. And in my time in Harrow, which is quite a number of years, I can't think of one instance where we've had a case that has been kicked out for not complying with PACE. Now, that's not to say that we've become complacent at all, but we're running with a set of processes and procedures that have so far served us quite well. But as I say, we're always willing to look at ourselves to make sure that we can't improve on what we do.
So does that mean, Justin, that you make the referral out to the CPS, or do you actually make a referral out to the police, who in turn will refer to the CPS?
So we've got a number of options. So we can the vast majority of any prosecutions that we would do would be through Harrow HBP, public law, Harrow and Barnet public law. So only in the event of perhaps it was a particularly complex case that we felt perhaps that an arrest was needed and a search and seizure, would we then put the case to the CPS? So obviously we've got those two options: Harrow, our own solicitors, or the CPS. So and as I said, I can't really think of any cases where they've turned around and said, we don't think your case meets the threshold.
Okay, thank you. And do you have any protocols in place with regard to anonymous evidence received?
Well, yeah, obviously every piece of information that comes across our desk is registered on our system, on our fraud system. It's given a unique reference number, and then obviously if it's anonymous, that information remains anonymous. And we're not in the business of revealing sources because it's against the law, and obviously we need to seek the confidence and the assurance of members of the public that they can talk to us freely and openly without fear of any reprisals or any repercussions.
Yeah, thank you. And my final question, Justin, was on the implication of the equalities, how you measure ensuring that there is no bias or discrimination in your investigations, and I'm referring to the equalities implications which are revealed in the report.
Yes. So, so there's a couple of ways really. So obviously, any information that comes across our desk, we have got a risk assessment system, which is called a 5x5 system, where we grade the quality of that information and the source of that information as to whether or not we can corroborate that or not. So that is the driver behind whether or not we think there's something untoward, and whether we think it's obviously in the public interest for us to take that on and it's financially viable for us to take that on. So that really is the main thrust of what we do. It doesn't suit anybody's agenda at all to take on a case that isn't financially viable. So it's driven by the level of risk, and it's driven by the financial impact on the authority and the potential reputational damage on the authority, and obviously whether or not we can corroborate that. So there are, I check 100% of the cases that come in and make sure that I think that it's worthy of being passed out to an investigator. So I have an officer that sits at the front end and acts as a filter, and they make sure that all the information that comes in goes onto the system, and then they undertake some preliminary background checks, and they would then pass the case to myself to look at, and I would then make sure that assessment is correct, and I think we should be investing resources in it. So that really is the only driver that will decide whether or not we should investigate or not.
So do you actually implement any audit on the impact of your strategy on those with protected characteristics? That's what I was focusing in on.
Sure. There isn't anything formal that I would do on a particular case around that, because it's not a consideration for me. When I mean it's not a consideration, I'm looking at the source and the quality and the impact upon the authority. So I'm assessing that information on its provenance and nothing else.
Yeah, but the reason why I'm focusing in on this is because when you conduct, or when your team conducts an investigation, yes, there is always going to be a risk, or a perceived risk, I should be more precise in saying, that there could be an element of discrimination, sure, or bias sure, against people with protected characteristics. And I just wanted to know what measures you have in place, okay, to ensure that doesn't happen.
Sure. Okay. So perhaps to give you a little bit of comfort, you talked earlier on about the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. Yeah. So the other main piece of legislation that we have to adhere to is called the Criminal Procedures Investigation Act of 1996, which essentially governs the way that we undertake that investigation, that we have to follow all reasonable lines of inquiry when a piece of information comes in. So, and what investigators are trained to do is, once that case comes across their desk, is they have to document everything that they do. So, and one of their first tasks would be to document an investigation plan and set out what they intend to do and why, so that there's a reasoning of why they're doing something, so that it's justified, and obviously so that I know what they're doing and why they're doing it. So there is that ongoing oversight and check to make sure that if it's gone to an officer, that's my responsibility because I have allocated that case and I would put my reasoning on it. And obviously they would then have to document everything that they do, because all of that information can be disclosable in court. So, you know, everything they put down is there in black and white.
Okay, forgive me, Justin, you haven't answered my question, and I don't want to labour the point, but what I was trying to establish is whether there are any procedures in place to ensure that there is no bias I can't think of the word, but to ensure that there is no bias on the part of investigating officers?
So, well, the procedures in place are that the fact that they have to abide by the law. They can't just go, they can't just go off on tangents for no reason, because I would then ask the question as to why they're following a line of inquiry which is irrelevant to what the information that's come in. So for management oversight, I would be asking them, well, why are you doing this when the allegation states you need to kind of look over here? So it makes no sense from a team and an organisation perspective as to why we would do that, because everything we document is there in black and white and can be disclosable if the solicitor asks to see it. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but as I say, we are heavily regulated in what we do, and people scrutinise our work quite regularly. And I have complete faith and confidence in my officers to make sure that they would not be breaking the law.
And please don't get me wrong. There was no such implication on my part.
No, I get, yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted to see whether you have in place any procedures to ensure that there is no perception of bias in terms of the conduct of your investigation, or in terms of investigating a particular group of people who happen to share a protected characteristic. That's what the focus of my questioning was all about.
Yes.
And the only reason I raise that is because of the equalities implications that were revealed in the report.
Sure. Okay.
But you've given a full answer, Justin. So thank you very much for that.
All right.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Benjamin. I had a couple of questions, but we've deliberately let it go on because I was enjoying listening to that debate and discussion actually, and quite rightly we asked those difficult questions and come back if we don't think we got a satisfactory answer. So thank you. But on the two areas I was going to cover was COVID-19 and reporting, and we've kind of touched on them, so I won't carry on discussing them. But it's not very often we talk in this committee about things that are in the news, and fraud is one of those. It's a very robust report. A lot of the themes in there, Justin, are very consistent, and we have seen before. And so one of the queries and questions I have, and it probably comes back to similar to what Councillor Benjamin was saying around prosecution, and we've seen in the news the postmaster prosecutions, which people in post offices due to computer processes. And I was going to ask, I'm probably going to be answering your own question, I was going to ask around, do we have human intervention in every case with regards to where we see fraud, given some of the miscarriages of justices we've seen? And this isn't an issue about raising the postmaster issue, it's more about our own processes and procedures. But I think you've given me sufficient confidence in your answer to Councillor Benjamin's questions with regards to the robustness of how you go about investigating these things, the human intervention. I think on one point you said you look at 100% of the cases, and I can't imagine there's thousands, but enough. And so that was going to be my question. And also as well, sometimes we get asked these questions as councillors, given what's sort of in public relations in the news at the moment, and you might want to come back and just make a reference to that, or not really, but it's up to you. Because you have been front and centre stage, haven't you, with regards to your question, haven't you? Like with regards to investigation and stuff.
Yes. I mean, are we talking in reference to the postmasters now, or is it kind of what?
Yeah. I just look. That's the theme. But let me rephrase my question than the statement. My question is, can you give the committee sufficient confidence that where computers and other processes identify wrongdoing, there's human intervention and no stone is left unturned before we formally prosecute and take people forward, really, because we are a trusted organisation, aren't we? And you're sitting in a very important but robust position, Justin.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, as I said, there's regular management checking of progress of investigations. If an officer wants to take a matter further, then they have to produce a report. The report comes to me. If I'm comfortable with it and I think that all the thresholds have been met in terms of further sanction action, then the matter then goes to Susan as well, so that we've got almost a double check, and we have a discussion around whether we think it's a strong enough case. And then finally, as I said, we've got another check then with the solicitors. And believe you me, the solicitors, if they're not happy with something, they will push back straight away and say, well, do we think we've got sufficient here or there? Do you need to do some further work? And I've not seen any watering down of that role that legal officers play, whether that's in HB public law or whether that's the CPS. They've got a big responsibility to make sure that there's public interest and that code that everyone works to is it's a very high threshold. I mean, beyond all reasonable doubt is a very, very high threshold to meet if the decision is made to prosecute somebody. So you've got to always plan for the worst case scenario for an investigator and for a manager of an investigation team, is that somebody opts to go for a trial by jury, because then you then have the eyes of the world on you, and the slightest mistakes you make will get exposed in a court, and nobody wants to go through that if there is a 1% chance that case could fail. So I'm comfortable with the processes that we have in place to make sure that Harrow doesn't end up on the front pages.
Good. Well, thank you for that clarification. And you've probably had your day in court under questioning for the last 20 minutes because there's been quite a few thrown at you, Justin, and also Susan as well. And so thank you. I'm going to move the meeting on now. So that was a really interesting discussion, and quite rightly, two very important areas of the council. So if we can move to the recommendations, and can I also just note that the internal audit charter was in there, our own one, and that was very concise as well. Justin and Susan, robust and also a pleasant read. So it's good to see that all the boxes are ticked on our own policies. So if we can, please, colleagues, on page 14, we've got two recommendations. Do I have the committee's approval to approve the recommendations? Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you. That's very helpful. And just before we do, just for our Democratic Services colleague, Andrew, if there was a particular question from Councillor Bardia to myself within that discussion under the internal audit plan, so if you could minute that particular request, that will ensure it's captured and it will be followed up duly and responded to Councillor Bardia regarding the corporate plan. Okay. We're now moving on to item 9, which is any other urgent business. I haven't been notified of any. However, there's only one area I would just like to reference, and I'm probably speaking again to you, Andrew, is Democratic Services. I note this is the last meeting of GARMS, which will take place at 6:30. The next one in July will revert back to 7:30, just because we have sort of gone back and forth on timings. Could you confirm that's correct?
Yep, I'll just quickly confirm that for you, Chair.
It is on the website, but as I say, I've just to manage expectations. But if you can confirm that at any time, but I'm would throw that out there for you to just confirm for members of the committee. So we now move on to item 10, which is the exclusion of the press and public. And so it's at this point we need to say thank you for observing to anybody observing, and for members of the committee and officers to revert and come back again into part 2. So I'm going to need to ask colleagues to sort of come out of the existing meeting and join in the link within MS Teams, so we can rejoin the meeting in a private session if possible. And it would be at this point I'll ask our IT colleague, he is available to delete the recording or stop the recording from here on in.